The Lake of the Ozarks is a really popular tourist spot this time of year, and it's huge, as in physically huge. But there was a time when no such lake existed, and that lasted until 1931. That's when the man-made lake was built. The story of how it got there is more dramatic than you might realize. So a couple of Ozarkians have documented that story in a new book, The People's History of the Lake of the Ozarks. Kent Van Landuyt, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
Thanks for being here. And Dan William Peak, hello to you too.
Thanks.
So you guys, before we get into the story of the Ozarks, I want to hear your personal stories so we can understand a little bit about where your curiosity and interest come from. You went to high school together, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, we're both from Versailles, went to high school there, and I've lived in that general area all my life.
Now, Kent, you're speaking right now. I'm going to stick with you for a second. Your career, most of it is working as a sociologist and planner for the state of Missouri.
That's true, and in that activities, a lot of it was in terms of economic development, and the Lake of the area, Ozarks area, is so unique compared to any place in the United States where you had a private corporation made a gigantic lake, and it was open to the public, and public could buy land up to the waterfront, which is really unusual, and that was what really opened the area up is for future development.
Okay, explain that a little more. We're going to get to Dan's relationship with the lake in just a minute, but I want to stick with this because it does sound unusual, and I guess when people know that there's been a man-made lake, there's kind of an assumption that this was a public project, but that's not the case here.
That's true. This was not a WPA project. It was not a Corps of Engineers project. It went from the development of a Union Electric power company in St. Louis looking for a place to build a power dam, water-powered dam, and this resulted from a Federal Water Act that had passed just before that time, and they ended up choosing the area on the Osage River to build the dam, and they were really not in the land development idea, any of that. They were just going to build this power dam to dam up the Osage River.
To turn on the lights in St. Louis.
Right, basically to serve the St. Louis metro area, because uniquely, that dam did not serve the rural area around central Missouri. Most of that power went straight to the St. Louis area.
Okay, so take me back, though, to what that area was like before there was a lake there. The culture, the ecology.
The lake area is Missouri, hilly, Ozarks, fairly country, kind of what people think of the country hillbilly. The people did not have electricity at that time. There were not any roads. There were trails. They traveled by foot, horse, or on a wagon.
Or mule, right?
Right. Mules were used a lot for work, and their education was at a country school, and those schools were staggered out through small communities. The area really only had 4 major towns along the Osage River, which were Tuscumbia, Bagnell, Lynn Creek, and Warsaw. And the other towns in that area were along the Rock Island Railroad, which essentially were Versailles and Eldon, the 2 bigger towns, and then Stover had a depot. So people that were very poor, they lived off the land, and the only real farming area would have been in the river bottom where there could have been some farming area.
There's something, okay, so I brought up mules because you write in this book about that people in the Ozarks actually had a really special relationship with mules.
Yes, mules were recognized as hard-working animals, reliable, stubborn, but people could farm with them and knew how to live off the land because that's essentially what they did.
And then you also write about a special relationship with fire in terms of how people lived off that land.
Yes, it was a tradition to burn off the woods every winter, about 3 reasons: to kill bugs, to get the brush burned down so it didn't get too much underbrush, and it was just kind of the process to get the land ready for every year because there's very little dirt, so what they could get from that process allowed them to do something next year in that area.
So how much does the culture that you've been describing here affect what happened once this project to build a lake started getting underway?
The local culture was impacted in two ways. This project started in 1929, right about the time of the Depression. And you can talk to older people, and we were able to interview people that said there was not a depression in that area because the construction of the dam employed about 4,000 people on any given day. Union Electric, in their records, said that they employed over 20,000 people. So therefore, people could find jobs there. Plus, railroads were wanting a lot of ties to build a railroad. Their timber was used for making railroad ties, and that was another big source of income. So those people, even though it was pretty much a cashless society and they lived off the land, there was a way for them to make a living and subside at that time.
So where does Dan, I want you to jump in here. What does the story of the Ozarks pre-lake mean to you?
Well, as Kent said, we grew up around there, so we knew a lot of people who actually had lived through the building of Bagnell Dam and the creation of the lake. So, and I'm a hillbilly, so, I play the banjo, I like moonshine, all that stuff that it is stereotypical.
No, go on. Tell me more.
So our relationship, I think, with the lake, we grew up after. If you don't mind, Kent, I'll give away our ages. We were born in 1945, so the lake had been there for 14 years when we were born. But as we were growing up, it was just kind of always there, And
but it was new.
It was new, and it was developing. At the time that I became more aware of it, which was around the end of the 1950s, there was just starting to be a kind of a coalition of forces that were going to bring it into the modern era. Up to that point, there really hadn't been that much development, but you had a group.
What was it like then?
Without the development?
Yeah,
it was kind of isolated. I mean, it was small lot development. That's what the Cyrus Crane Wilmore from St. Louis had bought the shoreline from Union Electric in 1945. And his idea was a small lot development of 50 feet of lakefront, 50 to 100 feet back, and then you built your little cabin on it. And Joy and I, my wife and I, live in one of these small lot developments. And so that was the idea, was that would be the way that it would be would come about. And at the time that we were, the early time that we were involved with it, or were living there, that's pretty much what you saw. It was small lake cottages, small boats. My wife and I have I think it's a 23-foot chaparral open bow, and now you see these 40-foot ocean-going vessels on the lake. So that would be a big difference right there. It was mostly seen in the 50s as a place to go for fishing and hunting and that sort of thing. Lee Mace's wife, Joyce, said that they didn't start their Ozark Opry shows until 9 o'clock back in those days because everybody was out on the lake.
So Lee Mace, this is a guy who you performed with, actually.
I did. I played in Lee Mace's Lee Mace's Hillbilly Hootenanny when I was 18. But he was part of that whole group that I was starting to talk about, the young entrepreneurial types down at the lake. There was Lee, a guy named Jim Franklin Sr., Al Elam, who plays a big role in this, and just a group of younger people. They were all under 40 at the time. And they were the first ones locally to recognize that the lake could be a commercial fulcrum, that they could actually profit from figuring out what people wanted to do.
What people wanted to do on a lake in Missouri?
Yeah, exactly. Or on a lake anywhere, I guess. because it was them, and then franchise businesses started coming in.
But wait, before we get to the next stage, I mean, for people who aren't from here, and maybe like a lot of our listeners probably have no idea who Lee Mace is. So can you talk to me a little bit more about this group of people you're talking about, realizing that there was commercial opportunity in the lake? What did they do?
Well, Lee was the first one to, in my opinion, was one of the first ones to recognize this. He and his wife had something called the Ozark Mountain Square Dancers, and they were hired by Nashville, by WSM, to be on the Grand Ole Opry. So they were the square dancers. You can still see them nowadays. They're actually were pretty well known, and they had a national following, that kind of thing. But Lee decided to come back to Osage Beach and start up his own music show, which was Lee Mace's Ozark Opry. So and it was very successful. By 1960, he had his own auditorium. He and this other his fellow entrepreneurs had started up the bank of the Lake of the Ozarks, which is still there. It's the central bank of the Lake of the Ozarks now. So, as I say, there was this group of what Kent calls champions, who what do you say? The positive something.
Champions are really people in a community, and you'll see this other places too, that take hold and develop for the total area, not just for their own business or what they're doing, but kind of that idea, we'll get together, we want to make the area stronger.
Right.
And you'll see that in a lot of areas. There'll be 4 or 5 people that are kind of leading the parade, bringing other people along and helping them for the good of the whole community. And that's what these 4 guys really were known for back in the 50s and 60s, of making the lake area known to everybody for a lot of different options to do, whether it's for entertainment, to just get away, for water sports or whatever. It's kind of, here's my area, I'm selling it, and please come.
You know, I guess we've jogged already pretty quickly into this period where we're, 15, 20 years along since the lake was created. But, I mean, before we talk about what's changed since the period that you're describing, what happened? I mean, how did the local community even react to the idea of a lake going in here to begin with?
Well, let me fill in. There's real story between 1930, when the dam was completed, and the 50s. A lot of things were happening nationally. The area was really, in the 30s and 40s, only popular in terms of, like, a few people would come down to hunt and fish and that type of thing. And there was 2 world wars going on. A lot of the young men were in service. You had a lot of young women that came to the Kansas City area and worked in what was called the defense plants, making products for the military. So the area did not have quite the draw at that time. And then in the 40s, late 40s, you had people going to Fort Leonard Wood from all over the United States. Fort Leonard Wood is not very far from Lake of the Ozarks. And they would take weekend leaves coming to the lake. So you had people from all over the United States seeing that area. People that were working in the cities were starting to get maybe a Saturday off so they could kind of come down on weekends. So that's transitioned over that time until the late 40s. And then in the early 50s, people started recognizing it from the especially Kansas City area, St. Louis area, and Iowa, coming down there for whether they wanted to hunt and fish, whether they want to take a week vacation down there. And that's when you started to see the growth start. And what happened to cause it to continue was, once they were down there for a week, well, they wanted someplace to be besides in the cabin, because cabins were not really very large. So they would start looking for restaurants and maybe a grocery store and maybe a place to buy souvenirs. And then all of a sudden, they were down there and they got a scratch on their arm and they needed stitches or something. Well, they need medical care. So then that demanded medical care.
So this is all a story of growth. As far as how the local community experienced it, was there also a piece of that was loss of something that was there before, loss of ownership in some way?
Well, what we'll call the old timers had already lost because their land and their little communities were inundated with the water. They were no longer there. And
so they lost land in just the construction of the
right,
lake.
in the lake. And so some of them moved outside of the area. And some started to realize, hey, these people are coming down here. Maybe I can make some money off of them. You know, knowing the area, they say, okay, they'd be hunting guides or fishing guides.
But it seems like just the experience of a lot of people losing land would create some resentments. Or just how did this all go down?
Yeah, well, that resentment is still evident. I mean, when we were writing this book, and remind me to go back and tell you about the Kansas City connection to the lake. The impetus for the lake actually started here with the Kansas City Joint Stock Land Bank. But there's still a sense of resentment. They call themselves true locals. Kent and I are true locals, you know, because our families go back way beyond when the lake was created by the impoundment. And so there's still that idea of us and them, you know, the newcomers and the true locals, and it's actually it's just barely below the surface sometimes. So there is, and it might be that it's passed along generationally. You know, in other words, if they took my land, you know, and I had to move into town and get a job. You know,
how did that happen? Did they was it?
Oh, well, that's
eminent domain, or
this is why we should go back a little bit. The dam originates with two Kansas City guys, with Ralph W. Street, who's a lawyer and real estate developer, and Walter P. Cravens, who is the president of the Kansas City Joint Stock Land Bank. You can still see the building, by the way. He built a magnificent building in 1923, and it's on 10th Street. I think it's 1510th or something. Library District, does that sound? But so they got together, and Street had always had this idea, or since 1912 at least, had this idea of building a dam on the Osage River and creating this lake, but it was all for hydroelectric power. Cravens had access to the assets of the Joint Stock Land Bank. He got into a lot of trouble. He did time, you know, but he transferred about $1 million, and the plan was to trade. We'll go down to the Ozarks. We'll tell these people in the Ozarks that we'll give them land in Kansas or Missouri that's actually farmable, and that way they won't mind giving us the property they have. Well, there's a little miscalculation there. So when they started to meet resistance, well, let me keep the story straight here, and it's all in the book. But Cravens was going to provide the financing. Street had apparently been down there before, and as it happened, they picked the perfect spot to do it because it was the right place on the river, and the local population was not organized. You know, there was no political or civic organization that would enable them to rise up and say, "Hey, we're not going to allow this to happen." So eventually, because Cravens went to jail, and you know, the Kansas City Joint Stock Land Bank, like all the land banks, failed. But the Union Electric then bought it and started evicting people.
You know, Kent, you also have some information about how people responded just to the news about what was possibly going to happen to them in their land, that not everyone even believed it was possible that they could lose their land.
Well, sure. I mean, when you're very poor and you've lived in that area, haven't seen any major construction, first the people hear the dam was going to be built, and they said, well, yeah, that'll take forever, and if it works. And then people were like, say, 30 miles upstream, you know, kind of hear about it, but say, well, something down there is not going to impact them. And then some never believed it would hold water. They didn't think the water would get that high. So those people were really in disbelief and, you know, really hardly accepted the idea that there would be that type of thing until they finally were taken off of their property. You know, their property had been purchased and they were, you know, made to leave, and that caused some of those challenges. And again, this was a very sparsely populated area, and there were a lot of little communities around there. Some communities would be gone, some communities would still be there. That area did not have what would call bigger towns, and it doesn't now. Today, in 2018, there is not any town within that four-county area that is larger than 5,000. But you got an area that functions like a metropolitan area with all of the services, all of the different job varieties.
So, but you've said that people that this initial incident of people being pushed off their land for the construction of the Lake of the Ozarks, even though so much has changed since then, that the resentment still persists.
Yes, it does. And you were right to mention eminent domain, because this is back in the 20s, before there was any real government regulation. So they were able to, it's rumored that Cravens had a deal with a Jackson County judge, so they were able to use eminent domain to get people off the land. But what they did is Street sent a crew down there with $5 bills in their pocket, and they went from house to house and said, "We'll give you a $5 bill for a 3-year option on your property." So then imagine the surprise of the mountaineer when somebody knocked on his door or her door and said, "We want to exercise the option on your property." And some people did take Cravens up on the deal and, got farmland in Kansas in exchange for their land. So it was an interesting thing, but the resentment still is there.
Well, I'm Gina Kaufmann talking with the authors of a new book, The People's History of the Lake of the Ozarks. If you've spent a lot of time on or around the lake and it means something to you, you can call us up and talk about it, whether it's the change you've noticed or the big question that you have at 816-235-2888. This is KCUR Central Standard. Welcome back to KCUR Central Standard. I'm Gina Kaufmann. My guests are Kent Van Landuyt and Dan William Peak. They are the authors of a book called The People's History of the Lake of the Ozarks. Hi again, you guys.
Hi.
Hi.
Why do you call it The People's History as opposed to what?
Well, this is really, our book is about the change of people. It's not a history like this building was here, or here's this building was built in 1890. It's what happened to the people, and that it is so unique, even nationwide, to have this facility privately owned. People can use it, and there's some people that choose to participate fully. There are people maybe live 10 miles to the lake and don't go there once a year. So it's about those lifestyles, how it changed from basic, very poor, rural people to the diversity you have in a metropolitan area with different jobs, different levels of education, different amounts of income, careers, ideas of the future.
We were talking earlier in the show about the Lake of the Ozarks you guys grew up on in the 50s and how it's changed from there is something we still haven't talked about. Can you get into that with me a little bit, Dan?
Sure. I think we stopped about 1960 there, and
with a community of small lakefront properties, little cabins lots. And things. Yeah,
right. And then so there was development then after that. Harold Koppler, who owned the Sage Park Plaza in St. Louis, and a guy named Burton Duenke developed these luxury resorts, Tiantara and the Lodge Four Seasons, which changed a lot of the nature of tourism there. Also, the general decision in the 60s and 70s was that they wouldn't sell the lake so much as they would sell some kind of exotic thing. There was a place called Max Allen's Reptile Garden. There was the Aquarama, where boys and girls wearing flesh-colored suits would fight underwater monsters. That went on from 64 to 73, I think. So the idea was to sell exoticism and that kind of thing. And that went on through the 70s. It wasn't until 1998. See, there are two sides to the lake. There's the Kansas City side and the St. Louis side, and they're actually known that way.
Huh.
The west side is the Kansas City side, and the east side is the St. Louis side, and they were not connected to get from one side to the other. To get from where Sunrise Beach over to Osage Beach, you'd have to drive all the way around the lake. In 1998, they built what they call a community bridge. It's a toll bridge, but it takes you from Sunrise Beach over to Osage Beach, which are the kind of epicenters of,
Oh, I'm just curious, like, just culturally, is there a big difference between the St. Louis side and the Kansas City side?
I would say so. I first noticed, I told Ken about this. I said, you can't buy a St. Louis paper on the Kansas City side. You can't track one down. Now, recently in Osage Beach, you started to be able to get, Kansas City. Did you have something, Ken?
Well, I was saying that the difference that we would hear, the west side, which locally we call the Kansas City side, it was more of a laid-back and slower routine. The east side was, hurry up, go, go get on the water, go water ski, hurry up, we got to go eat, that type of thing. There is a definite different style, and the things that serve those people are serving those types of styles. So there is actually living experiences to show the difference between the east side and west side, which kind of just really happened.
So Ozarks natives are telling us that Kansas City is more laid back than St. Louis, and that's speaking very strongly to my local pride. But let's hear from some of our callers, because we don't have a lot of time and people have some interesting stuff to share. Bill in Lenexa, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Good morning.
Hi, what do you want to share?
Yeah, my question is, my wife and I have a cabin at Truman Lake near Warsaw, and I was curious as to what the relationship between Truman Lake is to Lake of the Ozarks, and why do you think that the Truman Lake area hasn't developed like the Ozarks have in terms of tourism and growth?
Let's hear from Kent on that.
Well, there's one really simple answer. The Truman Lake is a Corps of Engineers lake, which does not allow development on the shoreline and that type of thing. So people can go there to fish and enjoy the water and that, but they cannot live on the shoreline and function in the way that they can on Lake of the Ozarks. And that's really what you will see in almost all Corps lakes. They don't allow that close development to the actual water.
Let's talk to Mike in South Kansas City. Hello, Mike.
Yeah, first I just wanted to answer one of your questions. The St. Louis side is the snob side.
Now we're getting it.
Yeah.
Right.
This guy must be a true local.
No, St. Louis looks down on Kansas City, and they continue that at the lake.
But as you can hear, we do not do that to them.
My question was when I was a kid back in the 50s, the people from Kansas City that went down there, they drove 50 highway, which was a 2-lane death trap, and then you get I don't know what at that time whether like 5 highway, that's the west side again,
right.
Kansas City side, 5 highway. What do they remember about the development of this, the condition of roads when they first remembered, and they've probably seen things change dramatically.
Yeah.
I'm going to hang up.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Well, yes, Highway 5 and being in Versailles, that's what some of us would do on weekend, because the highways came through the middle of the town, like Versailles and Eldon. We as locals would go up there on Saturday and watch all the traffic coming down. Look at all those people going to the lake. And it was a very crooked, narrow two-lane road. A lot of traffic accidents in those years. And, that's what we would see in people. All the way down to Camdenton, the road was very narrow, very crooked, and very slow traveling.
Was it paved back then?
Yes, it was paved probably in the 40s, and it was a challenge.
The idea that the locals and tourists would use different, even infrastructure, travel different roads is super interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, the whole thing is interesting. What happened in the late 70s and 80s through the 21st century is they started building condos. And I asked several of the people we interviewed, why did they do that? I mean, why didn't they take the Branson path and become an entertainment site? Well, they didn't want that. They wanted to have a fairly stable population.
Let's talk to Patty in Overland Park, who has a really surprising connection to this whole history of the Lake of the Ozarks. Hi, Patty.
Hi.
Tell us your story.
Thanks for having me on. My father was the son of an attorney who worked with the land bank. I don't know how closely, and I don't know how much trouble he got in. But they were invited to come down before the lake was created and stay in the hotel that would be demolished by the water the next day. Mm-hmm. So my grandfather, grandmother, and my father and uncle stayed down there and were told that the trees, they didn't know what to do with them. So the trees got chained to the ground. All this mass of trees that would be in the way of the lake got chained to the ground.
By who? Wait, who chained the trees to the ground?
I don't know, but in order to, maybe it was Corps of Engineers, I don't know. But in order to make the lake not have big old trees sticking up in it, they had to do that.
That's wild. Patty.
And it was an interesting time because the next morning after breakfast, they took their luggage, went up to the top of a hill, and watched the lake created.
Well, and it looks like Kent has some insight into that moment.
Yes, that was done periodically or all through the area at certain water lines. And again, it's not Corps of Engineers. That was part of Union Electric's job. They would hire men to go out and cut down all the trees up to a certain level so they would be way below the water line. A note of interest, many years later as the chains rusted, you could be boating and see a tree pop up.
Well, our time is up, as you can hear, but Dan William Peake, Ken Van Landuyt, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Their book is called The People's History of the Lake of the Ozarks. Could be good reading material this 4th of July. And that's a wrap. If you missed our earlier conversation about a new accent in liberal Kansas, you can hear it online at kcur.org/Central Standard. This conversation will be there too. Tomorrow, we'll be back with a show on DNA testing. Has access to information in your genetic code changed things for you? This episode of Central Standard was produced by Suzanne Hogan. I'm Gina Kaufmann. Up to Date is next.